Thank you, everybody, for coming to our something like eighth or ninth Patreon crowdcast. Very happy to welcome Dr. William Short of Hurstwic as our guest today. Will you give us a little bit of background about yourself and about Hurstwic and how it came to be and what you do?
Okay, sure. We pronounce it as Hurstwic, and
okay.
so people are aware. The name is just made up and is not really meant to mean anything. So all this started, I went through university, got a doctorate in a technical field, and was working in industry, mostly in the fields of acoustics and human hearing. And about 22, 23, 24 years ago, I learned that there were these things called sagas. And I read one and I liked it. And I read a few more and I really liked it. And I wanted to learn more. And I found that there was a summer course at the University of Iceland. And so I took that 22 years ago and haven't looked back. Really came to love the stories, but also the people of Iceland, both the ancient ones and the modern ones, and the land. And when I got back from that experience, I wanted to do some sort of hands-on research with the Viking Age, if you will, experimental archaeology, but I wouldn't have called it that back then because I didn't know the term. And I found there was a group here in New England already doing that, and that group was called Hurstwic. It was formed by two fellows, and we started doing some things. And one of the things I realized as soon as I had joined is they had had a serious weapons injury just before I joined, and I realized we couldn't do that. And so I took over the weapons training. Now, mind you, I have no martial arts experience at that time, but I just wanted to avoid the injury and started looking around. Now, HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts, was just barely getting off the ground at that time. And I found that there was a museum of arms and armor near us called Higgins Armory Museum. And they had started a program to do research and training in HEMA, and specifically the longsword of Joachim Meyer. And so I joined that group, and thinking that even though the longsword was nothing at all like Viking weapons, at least it would be a place to start.
Sure.
And that turned out to be useful in many ways. Now, Hurstwic fell apart very quickly. Within less than a year after I joined it, the two founders both left, and the rest of us decided to let it drop. And I just kept up the website because the website seemed to be getting a lot of hits and getting a lot of interest. And kept the Hurstwic name going with the website. Meanwhile, the research was continuing at Higgins Armory Museum, and I started bringing in people who, like me, had an interest in Viking fighting. And so we were trying to do the best we could with the materials we had. And it was just really good being with a group of people that had a focus and had a goal, even if it wasn't the same goal as mine.
Sure.
And then we started doing demonstrations of Viking fighting at the Higgins Museum, and the research continued and continued and continued. And we were starting to do research in things not related to combat. Like, we were very, very interested in the Viking ball game, Kanatleikur. And so we did a lot of research in that, trying to figure out how that worked, and started playing the game. It was tremendous fun. And we were very interested in food and nutrition. How did Viking Age people stay alive? How did they stay healthy? And so we did some fascinating nutritional analyses of Viking Age diets to understand how they got their nutrients. And that was fascinating. And we were very curious with, for instance, how should you row a Viking ship? What's the right way to row it? So we did some experiments there, and came to some conclusions that there was a particular way that was both very efficient of human energy and also provided a great deal of speed compared to other things that we tried. So we were doing a lot of things outside of the combat. And a lot of this work was coming together, and I ended up writing a book about Viking weapons and combat techniques. And I had submitted it to the publisher. It hadn't been printed yet. And I went to Iceland and did a lecture on the book, on the material in the book. And one of the people in the audience was a fellow by the name of Reynir Askersson. Reynir was an Icelander. He didn't know much about the sagas, but he knew a lot about the fighting. And afterwards, he said, I'm not sure that what you're talking about here is right. And that led to a fabulous collaboration between the two of us, where we were sharing ideas, where I was able to provide a lot of information about the sources, the literary sources, and some of the other sources, but he was able to provide a lot of good information, a lot of good suggestions about how it is we should be doing our fight training and our fight research. And that led to a rebirth of Hurstwic and a real acceleration of our progress in understanding how Vikings fought and used their weapons. And that led to eventually our starting a fight school, basically, to teach people a research lab, if you will, where we could do this research and make a lot of noise and create a lot of commotion and outside of the museum environment. And that really pushed forward our research in the combat. And that led to training videos. It led to a series of documentary films on some of the Saga heroes. Well, we went to Iceland and actually went to the locations of the battles described in the sagas and shot a film based on it using our own people as well as experts. And it just continues on. So we continue our research into Viking fighting.
Well, that seems like a lot of fun. So my curiosity is, what was it that was so different in Rainier's view of it from yours? What did he change so much?
Okay. First of all, how shall I put this? He did not allow me to get away with anything. He is the master of the Socratic method. And so he was constantly asking, how do you know that? What does that really mean? Go deeper here. And so things that I would be willing to accept on evidence more flimsy than I should have accepted, he was not willing to accept. So we're constantly digging deeper, trying to find the answers to these questions about how it is that Vikings fought. And he also had a lot of ideas on how to train. In other words, for us to do this research, we need a core of competent fighters. We need people who have the fundamental skills to use these weapons. So one of our goals in all of this work with combat is developing a core of competent fighters so that we can do our research. So learning those fundamental skills is something that he was tremendously helpful with in coming up with drills, coming up with ideas, coming up with things that we ought to be exploring so that we can develop our fundamental skills.
Are there people involved in Hurstwik who have a military background? Has that contributed to how this works?
Yes. One of the people that joined us was a career special forces man. And his expertise was what he contributed to this. His name was Robin Cooper. And what he contributed to this was he sort of kept us in line. Like he would say, I'm not sure that that makes sense. And okay, this makes sense based on my own experience. But in terms of the actual fighting, the fighting is very different than what he was used to. One of the things that is important for us is we do these outdoor training sessions from time to time where we try to set up scenarios that are described, for instance, in the sagas. And we see for ourselves how they work. And ambushes are frequent occurrences in these literary sources. So we tried to set up an ambush and see how it worked. And Robin sort of guided the ambushers to find their place in this natural setting, which is a snowy woods. And then the other people came along, not unknowing what it was they were getting into. They did not know that there was an ambush. They were told something totally different and were not expecting it at all. The ambush started, but Robin had set us up as if we were all using firearms. And that doesn't work for Viking weapons. We were all too far apart to make it work. So Robin had many good ideas. Sometimes they didn't quite work right.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I was wondering about this a little bit myself. I mean, I shoot USPSA style events, right? I mean, there's a lot of footwork. There's a lot of, target transitions and things like that. And I've wondered a little bit how much that would transfer. And it's my impression that really wouldn't transfer very much.
Yes.
I mean, it's very different, I would imagine, when you were face to face
most
of the time. And, reading the sagas, there's so little use of archery that's ever mentioned. Gunnar Hermundarson is one of the few really prominent archers in the sagas of Icelanders, but he's an unusual character in other ways.
Yes.
Which saga was it that originally caught your attention, by the way?
So people ask me that, and I really can't remember. It was probably the Vinland sagas that I read first, followed by some short saga. And, subsequent to that, I've probably read all the sagas many, many times in English and many times in Icelandic as well.
So you got the whole 5-volume set.
I have the English set and I have all the Eastlandsk Fornrit editions as well.
Those are nice.
Yes, they are. They're very, very
useful. Well, let's take questions straight from the audience here. I've certainly got questions I can throw at you.
Okay, before we do that, there's one more point I'd like to make about the archery. You talked about Glima. And we were fascinated by that episode where someone cuts his bowstring. And so he asks his wife for a lock of her hair so that they can make the bowstring. So we were wondering, would a human bowstring work? So we tested it. Rather than guessing, we tested it. We made a bowstring out of human hair and we checked, for instance, the accuracy. Did that change? No. The power of the shot, did that change? No. So we would have to conclude that the human hair bowstring is something that really works.
I would not have guessed that. I have taken that scene for 20 years.
Yes, here's one of our archers with a human hair bowstring.
Oh my gosh, I would never have guessed that. For 20 years, I've taken that as being a purely symbolic interaction. That impresses me.
Yes. And that's the kind of work we do. I mean, another example of the crazy stuff. You read in some of the sagas, especially the king sagas, about men who are wearing a male shirt, and they jump overboard and sink to the bottom and drown. So we're curious, can you swim in wearing a male shirt? So we tried that. And the answer is yes, some people could, most people couldn't. And we were trying to figure it out. So, the first few people who tried it swam, like 3 strokes and sank to the bottom. And then some people swam further, but still sank to the bottom. But there were 2 people who succeeded. And the people who succeeded were people who swim in the sea in the cold North Atlantic Ocean on a regular basis. One an Icelander and one a fellow from Cape Cod. They had no problem swimming in the male. And I think it just has to do with a mental attitude more than any sense of strength or anything else. The sea is trying to kill you. It's tried to kill them before. They know what to expect. And so they just kept on going.
Well, I can see that. Yeah. A certain even-keeled attitude. Yeah. How much does that male shirt weigh?
So it's about 30 pounds.
Yeah. That's a lot to swim in.
Yeah. But, people swim in heavy stuff in other ways as well. So it's just a matter of changing your mental attitude. I can do this. It's trying to drag me down, so I'll swim in a different way so I stay up on the surface. So it is possible.
Sure. Well, and I suppose that say Navy SEALs or what's the German group, the Kampfschwimmer, I guess they swim with quite a bit of heavy equipment. So
yes. And at the same time we were doing that, something else we were talking about, the sagas talk about people who are swimming across the river. They put their shield on their back, and that protects them from arrows and also spears. And we were wondering if there's something special about that. So we also tried that. And it turns out, yes, that when the shield is just under the surface of the water, the arrow doesn't penetrate. It bounces off and comes back out. We don't have a good explanation for that, but it really makes a lot of sense that, with the shield back there, it provides much more protection than just a dry shield in air.
I can see it. And I think there's a scene is it Gisli's saga where he flees in that way, where he's swimming?
I don't think of Gisli as that. I remember he is swimming and they're throwing spears at him, but it actually penetrates the water and so on. But Bjarne Saga has an example of that, where Björk is swimming across the river that's near his farm with a shield on his back, and the shield protects him.
That's awesome. I would never have thought about it. But this is great. I mean, that you have this sort of living laboratory of people who are getting familiar with using these tools and just seeing what works. I think that's a really interesting project.
Yeah. So something that's important to say is, we're not trying to prove something is true. We're not trying to prove that the sagas are true, that they're the absolute truth. Nothing like that at all. We're very science oriented. So what we're constantly trying to do is falsify an idea. We have this idea, and basically science is a process by which you get an idea and you do everything in your power to falsify it, to basically to throw it away, to break the hypothesis. And only after a number of attempts to break it and it fails to break, you cannot say that this is the truth. The best you can say is this looks good enough for us to continue on to the next step. So we are constantly trying to break ideas. So if we get an idea that something might be true, that's sort of the way we approach it. We go step by step by step by step, trying to figure out how to break it. And the example, one of my favorite examples, is a move that's mentioned in a couple of sagas where people are fighting. And first of all, it appears based on these literary sources that fighters were ambidextrous. It mentions many times that people would swap weapon hands, and that would allow them to cut out from an unexpected angle and get past their opponent's defense. But what if you have a sword and a shield? What do you do then? Well, the sagas say that there were people who could throw them both up in the air and catch them in the opposite hands and continue fighting and strike out on the unexpected side. So at first you might say, that's Hollywood. That's nonsense. But we wanted to try it because it matches up with the Viking mindset, the way of fighting. You do these kinds of tricks, if you will, to get the advantage so that you can make the kill. So to do this, first of all, we need some skill with sword and shield. So we get those fundamental skills. That's what I mean by trying to build up a core of fighters who have these fundamental skills. So we know how to use a sword, we know how to use a shield, we know how to use them together. And then you try it sort of a step at a time. Can you throw the sword up and catch it in the other hand? Yes. Can you throw the shield up, catch it in the other hand? Yes. Can you throw the sword and shield up together and catch them in opposite hands? Well, that's a little bit more difficult. You have to arrange the trajectories so they don't collide in the middle, but you can do that. So you practice it a bunch of times till you get it, so you can do it consistently. And then we have to pressure test it. And this is a key part of what we do. Like pressure testing, like a cylinder that holds gas or something like that. You apply pressure to it and see if it leaks. Then you apply more pressure to see if the seams are starting to burst or if a gasket breaks or something like that. And you keep applying pressure until it finally breaks. And that's how you pressure test something. We do the same sort of thing. So now we start throwing up the sword and the shield, or we have someone annoying us. Perhaps they're doing some sort of attack to us. Perhaps they're doing something else. But you have someone that you're working with that's trying to break it. They're trying to mess you up. And, it continues to work. So now we need the ultimate test. We need to try it in combat. And now we have a real difficult problem, because when you do these kinds of moves in combat and they work, you kill your training partner, and that's not acceptable today. So we need to find a way to test these at the kind of intensity that would have happened in a Viking Age fight, but in a safe way, in a way that's acceptable. And that is a big part of our research, figuring out how to do that, figuring out training tools that make sense, figuring out protocols that make sense, figuring out experiments that make sense. We need to find a way to do simulated combat. And we think we've got something that works fairly well. And for lack of a better term, we call it sparring. That sometimes gives the wrong impression to people, but it's the best term we've got. So we try it in sparring. In other words, I am going to try to use this move of throwing up sword and shield to make the attack on the opposite side. And my sparring partner is trying to do everything in his power to make it not work. Not only is he going to try to mess it up if I do the move, but at the same time, he's trying to knock my head off. He's actively fighting me. Okay, so we do these fights. We try this in sparring, and I can say that in sparring, throwing up the sword and shield works magnificently. It really works. It is, as someone who is facing a person using this trick, you have no idea what just happened. You just know you've gotten hit in the side of the head and you don't know where it came from. So these kinds of experiments tell us, hey, here's a move from the saga that seems kind of unlikely, but we've tested it to the best we know how. We've tested it at very high pressure levels. It still seems to work. So we're going to say, yeah, maybe this was a move that Vikings used.
Well, that's amazing, because it also suggests one thing that's a little bit surprising to me, which is that the saga authors may well be experienced in this sort of combat. They've seen what kind of moves work, and you wouldn't necessarily think that the Saga authors would know that much about combat, because you would think there's probably not the overlapping populations most of the time, right? You would think clerical trained people writing the sagas and you know, a pretty different population doing the fighting. But that's interesting.
Okay.
I'm
Here
surprised.
I would probably disagree with that statement a little bit, because one area of our work has been to try to understand how much of Viking Age combat would the Saga authors have known. So first of all, they were separated in time. In other words, by the time the sagas were written, the weapons and the use of weapons was quite different. And additionally, who were these people who are fighting? Now, if you believe that some of the sagas started to be written in the Sturtlinga era, that was just an era of constant battle, near civil war. And so it's very likely that people would have been familiar with fighting. And we have compared how fights are described in Sturtlinga Saga, and especially Íslendinga Saga, to how they're described in the sagas of Icelanders. So Íslendinga Saga was written by Þórður Sturluson. Do I have that right? Yes, I think so.
Thordarson. Yeah, but yeah.
Anyway, but not only was he a witness to the battles he described, he was also a participant in many of them. He was clearly, from what he writes about and from other sources, a skilled fighter, very familiar with fighting. And he describes fights in which both Viking Age weapons and Viking Age techniques are used at the same time in the same battle as the newer weapons and the newer techniques. He clearly understands the difference. He clearly sees that there has been a progression in the weapons, and he writes about them with at least a sense of accuracy. So if he knew the difference, perhaps other Saga Age authors and the sagas of the Icelanders, which were being written at about the same time, also knew that difference.
Sure.
So that kind of analysis that makes us think, hey, maybe some of these saga authors really knew what they were talking about.
Well, and that in itself is a fascinating data point.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at some questions over here.
Sure. Sorry.
We got John Daly. Since you mentioned archery, it was generally viewed as cowardly in Greece and Rome. Do we know if the shortage of archers in Viking warfare was tied to their own concepts of honor and shame?
Okay. So I will say this. I'm not sure that there was any shortage of archers in Viking combat. So if one looks at especially mass battles as described in the King Saga, the archery was very much a part of those battles. Now, the smaller scale battles that we read about in something like the sagas of Icelanders, no, archery was not as big a part of that, simply because it seems like it would be less necessary. You got a small group of people, A and B, they meet, they fight, some of them die, and eventually they disperse. Archery seems to be less important. But certainly in any kind of mass battle or any kind of naval battle, archery was a big component.
Sure. It strikes me that strikes me as realistic, that when you have larger forces, archery is a bigger deal than when you have small forces that are all going to get kind of tangled together. At that point, an archer is a much less useful individual.
It becomes a melee, in a small scale battle, it becomes a melee between small groups of people. And that's the way the sagas seem to describe it. But these larger scale battles, you've got, the two lines facing each other, but you've got all these other people farther back, and their conventional weapons, their swords and their axes and so on aren't going to reach. So they're going to use projectiles until they can get close enough to do something. And those projectiles are often arrows and also spears.
Sure. Well, and you mentioned the King Sagas, and in the King Sagas, there's certainly many critical moments where someone has an arrow wound, right? So that's certainly a big part of that. I have a question for someone who couldn't be here. Actually, I have two questions for people who can't be here. So Auburn AL asked, about the role horses played in Norse combat. Would their role be different in a raid launched from a ship versus a conflict in which the combatants would be traveling overland from the beginning to end of the journey? So horses in combat.
Okay, so Viking Age people did not fight from horses. They did not have anything like cavalry.
Hmm.
They fought on foot. So they might travel to the fight on horseback, but they would dismount and then do their fighting. Why is that? I do not have a good answer. Certainly other people in Europe at this time had mounted troops of various types, but Viking people did not seem to do this. So if they were on a raid, presumably they disembarked from their ship and they did their raid where they could walk to, basically. So I think a lot of their raids were close to the sea or to rivers that they could navigate with their ships. And that was one big advantage of their ships. They were so shallow draft that they could sail all sorts of places where Europeans were simply not expecting a ship to appear. If they needed a horse, I presume they would just steal one. Just take it.
Well, and the English also don't use horses at this period. I mean, isn't that part of why the Battle of Hastings is won by the Normans? Because the Normans have cavalry. I mean, the English are showing up and dismounting to fight mounted warriors. Yeah, it's interesting that the idea of cavalry is so new in a way. I mean, right? I mean, like you wouldn't think that this would be that novel of a concept, but it simply doesn't seem to fit into their picture of combat. I mean, do you have a thought of why that might be?
I do not. I can only make a wild guess, and here is where the romantic comes out. So I always have to be careful about keeping a lid on that sort of thing. But it very much seems to be the case that Viking Age people wanted to fight up close and personal.
Mm-hmm.
So their weapons tend to be close range weapons, and some of the most brutal style of combat, and it actually turns out to be a big part of the combat, is empty hand, what we call empty hand combat, grappling. The understanding the wrestling of the Vikings is key to understanding how they used their weapons as well, because there's so much overlap, especially in the mindset and the physical thing. And grappling is very close range. You're basically at kissing range by the time you're grappling. So it's very up close and personal. And it seems like that was what was desired when weapons were in use as well.
Well, and there's a lot of wrestling in the sagas. I mean, Hagel's Saga, of course, leaps to mind. But in many of them, do you find a lot of input from modern Icelandic Glima? Do you find a lot of continuity there?
Yes. So I will not speak a whole lot to this because my collaborator Reynir in Iceland has just finished an amazing set of research on how Viking wrestling evolved into Icelandic Glima, and there is an unbroken path, and there are many similarities, despite the fact that modern Glima is so formalized a wrestling sport. But there is a close connection between the two, and so it's very useful to understand where modern Glima came from to understand the ancient Viking wrestling.
Okay, is a belt a big part of the Viking wrestling too?
No, the belt. I don't want to talk about what his research, but yeah.
I always think about the weird belt thing.
Yeah, the belt is a modern invention.
Okay, all right. Phoenix asks, has anyone asked about whether or not they had flaming arrows? I was watching a video on general medieval combat, more Robin Hood age. It was heavily critical of flaming arrows, saying they didn't make sense. So I was wondering if that was accurate.
Okay, I have no information, nothing that suggests that Vikings used flaming arrows. Sorry.
Okay. It's not surprising. And then here's another question from someone who couldn't be here. Susan asked, I assume bloom and bog iron are synonymous. I'm curious how pure bog iron products were made in Iceland and whether the composition can be used to place the origin of Viking Age artifacts like ship nails rather than assuming by place of discovery. So
I am grateful for this question because that is an area where Hurstwik has done a tremendous amount of research in the past 2 years, roughly. So how iron was made in the Viking Age Scandinavia is pretty well understood, but how iron was made in Viking Age Iceland was not understood, and the secrets were lost. Basically, no iron has been made in Iceland in probably 700 years.
Hmm.
It all seems to stop around the year 1300. And we were very curious to find out what the missing secret was. So we did a lot of research. And last year and last fall, in a very public festival in Iceland, we made the first bloomery iron in Iceland in probably 300 years. The iron is excellent. The iron is really first rate. And that surprised a lot of Icelanders because they always had in their mind that this bloomery iron made in the Viking Age was not very good. In fact, it's excellent.
Hmm.
And it would be easy to make a weapon from this iron. We analyzed the iron. The iron that we made is 100.0% iron. So it is elemental iron. Now it has inclusions of slag, but a good smith would be able to get most of that slag out of the iron by continually folding it, forge welding it, folding it, forge welding it, which pushes a lot of the slag out. So it'd be very possible to make a good quality weapon from the bloomery iron found made in Iceland. And that also goes for Scandinavia as well. The iron ore that's available in Iceland is also first rate, just truly excellent and available almost everywhere. Iron abounds in Iceland. So the materials, the artifacts, the iron artifacts made in these lands were probably just excellent. Now, the question is, can you identify where an artifact came from based on analyses of the iron? And the answer is too soon. Ask again.
Okay.
It's an area of intense research. Now, the problem is, if you'd really like to know, you need to break off a piece of iron from this precious sword and analyze it. And not too many museums or collections are willing to allow you to break off a piece.
Of course.
So if we can find a way of doing this that's non-invasive, and there are many people working on this, maybe we'll get some good answers.
All right. I remember visiting a museum in, I believe it was Holt in Norway, that had quite a display about how iron artifacts were made in the Viking Age.
Yes.
It made an impression on me because of how incredibly difficult it looked.
Yes.
I mean, that it is not a simple process.
No,
And
it is.
Just considering how anyone came up with it.
Yes. Yes. It's very, very material and time intensive. Just getting enough charcoal to make the iron is a huge project. Finding the ore, that's no problem. Building the furnace, that's no problem. But then the actual day of the smelt, it's many people working very hard for many hours. And you end up with, if you're really good, maybe 10 kilograms, 20 pounds of iron. And then you do that again and again and again. Now, what got me personally interested in this whole project, I was visiting some friends in the east of Iceland, and we went to visit one of their friends, a farmer. He lives in the area called Eidar, which was a major farm in medieval Iceland. And the farmer there showed us the piles of slag from the iron production on the farm back in the day. Now, these mounds of slag were 2 stories high. They were taller than some of the buildings, which suggests a huge amount of iron was made on the site in around the Viking Age. So I went and looked at the archaeological report, and their estimate was that over 200 to 300 year period, 1,000 tons of iron was made at that site. And that just boggles my mind. How can you possibly make that much iron? That is an immense amount of wood. Where do you find all the wood? Well, it was all forested then, so the wood was there, but still it's a huge amount of labor to cut down the trees, to cut them up, to turn them into charcoal, to break up the charcoal, just to get the fuel, much less all the other aspects of what goes on in making iron.
Yeah. Wow. that does boggle the mind, especially as you mentioned in Iceland. But as it may be the case that it was more forested back then, I've certainly heard. They certainly believed it was, and I know some scientists have suggested that seems like a real memory. Let's see. John Daly asked, did the Vikings have any unique tactics or tools that they used in naval combat?
So I'm going to answer more generally and then focus in on the naval combat, if I may. So Viking fighting did not seem to be technique driven. There's nothing like that. Everything guides us to the idea that a Viking fighter simply wanted to destroy whatever was in front of him, just obliterate it. So it was power based. So you do the axe blow so that it splits the skull down to the shoulders, and it's all power based. The way so it's not technique driven. There's not all the fancy movement that you see in the later combat treatises that the HEMA people are using, like Meyer and Mayer and so many others. Naval battles were basically land battles that were fought on floating islands. So basically the ships came together and grappled and were tied together. And the idea that was that you went on the enemy's ship and cleared the deck, fighting on the deck, trying to kill as many people as possible, clear the deck, and then you connect to the next ship in the line and fight them. And so you continually are clearing the decks. So it's like a land battle on these floating islands. So it's not particularly technique driven, is my sense.
I can see that. And I mean, you certainly see that in the sagas. I mean, to go back to Njal's saga, of course, Gunnar and Kolskager are attacked, and I think Kolskager throws the anchor from their ship to sink one of the other ships, but then they I don't know how they get attached to the other ship, but they go over onto it and fight on that deck, which is not that different from, say, Greek or Roman naval combat, as I understand it. It is not ships fighting ships. It is guys fighting guys with ships as the land.
Yes.
Almost.
So this idea of grappling the opposing ship and pulling it together, sort of bow to bow, and then fighting there, seems to be the go-to move in naval combat in the Viking Age.
Right. I mean, it almost makes me wonder why fight in a ship at all. But then, of course, in some sagas, you have. I mean, I'm thinking of a more mythical-ish saga with Aerod saga, where I believe they go to an island after confronting some people they want to fight on ships, getting off of the island and fighting on it, which maybe makes a little bit more sense for everybody. But then, of course, actually, you've got the ship then as a potential prize, so you're probably trying not to destroy the other person's ship.
Exactly. Yes, and that comes through again and again in the sagas. You're trying not to damage the ship. It's a very valuable commodity. So you're trying to kill the people without damaging the ship.
Well, and that's also something that I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but an impression that I have is that there's a lot more scavenging involved after combat because everything is precious. There's such a scarcity of good stuff that you want what is left over, and something like a sword is that's a Lamborghini back then, for as rare as it would be for someone to have a good one. And so when you read of people buried with that stuff, that itself is a status statement because they have a family that is able to send them to the grave with stuff that otherwise everyone would want to scavenge.
Okay, I would disagree slightly with something you just said, and that is the idea of scavenging the battlefield. Now, reading through all the literary sources, it does not seem that happens very much. And there's at least one case I can think of when someone was seen scavenging the battlefield and pulling valuables off of dead bodies, that someone went up to him and killed him for doing that because there was a sense that this was not an honorable thing to do. So I simply do not know. Now, something else that comes into the equation is Vikings had this very strong sense of luck, that you try to associate yourself with lucky people and lucky things. And I have to ask the question, well, this weapon didn't protect me. I'm dead. Maybe it's not such a lucky weapon after all. Maybe someone didn't want that weapon because it was not a lucky weapon. I simply do not know.
Well, that's a good thought. I mean, and you're absolutely right to bring up the luck question there. I mean, you know, in the sagas, you see people regarded as unlucky simply because they're ugly. I mean, I can see some. I mean, it's real, and I could absolutely see someone's weapon being regarded as unlucky because they died holding it. Yeah, I can see what you mean. That's an interesting point. Let's see. Gabriel here asks: is there any evidence for evolution of fighting style, whether through cultural exchange, technology, etc., or do you think fighting styles stayed relatively static?
Okay. That's an interesting question, and it's a little complex, so I'll try to answer it, but I'll answer it sort of pieces at a time.
Okay.
My sense is that Viking fighting during the Viking era was more or less static. It wasn't like there was some great development that changed how people fought or changed how they used their weapons during the Viking Age, during those 3 centuries. Now, that is not to say that there was no contact with other people, other Europeans and even Asians who had different fighting styles and different weapons. But whether they were adopted widely or even adopted at all in the Viking lands is still a bit of a mystery. So an example that comes to mind is the Eastern Europeans were using bows in their archery that were composite bows that were made of horn and wood and sinew that would have a lot more draw weight than a conventional longbow, and have significant advantages, especially for someone who was fighting on horseback, as the Eastern Europeans did at this time. Did any of the Viking Age people use this kind of Hunnish bow? And the answer is we have no evidence, but we have some really intriguing evidence from Iceland, of all places. In the place where Gunnar and his brother were ambushed on the river Brangau, there was a battle. It's described in some detail in the saga, and it's said that Gunnar had his bow. And in the mid-20th century, some bodies were uncovered near that battle site. And one of the artifacts found on one of the bodies was interpreted as the thumb ring that you'd need to use for one of these Hunnish horn bows. So maybe they were used in Iceland times. It would be a terrible, terrible place to try to use a composite bow of this type because the climate would be very ill-suited for it because of the cold, wet weather. But maybe, you know, it's intriguing that maybe they reached as far as Iceland. We don't know.
What is the weather argument against a composite bow of that kind?
Oh, so if it's wet like that, it is very likely to lose its flexibility. It's going to become floppy rather than have the strength to resist the drawing motion. So basically, the horn provides a much stiffer spring than the wood can, so it stores the energy there. So with a relatively short draw, you can store up a huge amount of energy in the horn.
Well, that reminds me of something a little bit more local. The Shoshone, or the early Shoshone, the sheep eaters in Wyoming used bighorn ram horn bows.
Yes.
That's a cool connection. Well, and that's a very cold environment up in the Wind Rivers. Huh. I'm learning a lot here.
So in answer to the original question, no, it doesn't look like there was a lot of evolution. Now, what was going on was there were some changes in the weapons, but the changes in the weapons were not such to cause changes in the fighting style. So smiths were able to make better and better weapons because they were able to make better and better iron as the Viking Age progressed. And that changed the nature of the swords over the centuries, but it did not seem to in any way change the fighting style.
They are perfecting concepts they've already come up with rather than exploring new concepts, more or less.
Yes,
We got Cameron Patterson here asking, how long would prestigious items like swords typically be passed from generation to generation?
Okay. It's a fascinating story. What we see in archaeology is blades that are based on for stylistic reasons. We say this blade was probably 300 years old, but it has a new hilt that is current and modern when it was buried with its owner. And we have that in the literary sources, that swords went from generation to generation to generation for centuries and were continued to use. Now, the blade doesn't really wear out, the blade doesn't change, but the hilt needs to be renewed on a regular basis. So it is very possible that swords were literally used for centuries before they were finally buried or lost or broken or whatever happens to a sword that makes it not useful anymore. And we can tell that because the hilt age doesn't match the blade age.
What kind of maintenance is involved in a sword blade? It's oiling, whetting. What do you need to do to keep a sword good for that long?
Okay. So to make it useful, it needs to be sharp. And that's another area that we're very curious about. How sharp are swords in the Viking Age? And our best guess is they were very sharp their entire length. If you think about what kind of tool you need to butcher an animal, a sharp tool is really a good one. And that's what swords do. They butcher humans. And so you want a very sharp tool, and you want it sharp right down to the crossguard. And we look at some historical swords that have survived in excellent condition. And you know what? They're sharp down to the crossguard. It's even 1,000 years later. Amazingly so. So it makes sense that they were kept sharp. So a swordsman, someone who had the wealth and prestige to own a sword, knew how to take care of it. So he would keep it sharp. And a very common item in graves is a whetstone. So even in the afterlife, people wanted their weapons sharp. So,
and is it oiled against rust or?
Yeah. So they would be kept oiled. So presumably, if they weren't in use, they would be kept in an oiled cloth. And the scabbards that you would store your sword in would have, as its innermost layer touching the sword, something that was oily, often sheep fleece that had lanolin on it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I was wondering about that. So when you mentioned swords kept for 300 years, I thought they're not just being left in a corner.
No, not at all. And that's something that's come up in some fairly recent research looking at the wear patterns of swords. And it's very clear that these were everyday companions, that people wore their swords every day, constantly. It wasn't just something special for battle that you brought out when you thought you might have to fight. This was something every day. And the wear pattern suggests that people would, you carry your sword here on your left hip, that people would put their hands on the pommel on a regular basis, maybe to emphasize that they were wearing a sword or to emphasize the threat that the sword represents. But they would be putting their hand on the pommel on a regular basis. And the wear pattern on some of these pommels is very, very representative of that kind of handling of the sword.
That makes perfect sense. And I mean today, wearing a rifle or wearing a pistol outside the waistband, your hand often does just rest on it. I mean, if nothing else, it's to remind you that you're still in control of it. I don't know if it's always for display of somebody else. That's interesting. And I mean, and today, of course, that continues in our culture, at least. I mean, I have a 30-30 that was my great grandfather's. That just got passed down and just has been well cared for, and it certainly has the marks of many hands that have been upon it. And then here's a random fact, I have a sword that is about 450 years old that my grandfather found in a cave in New Mexico.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's an old Spanish sword. It is not sharp at all, though. I think it was somebody's chopping sword.
One more thing, if I may, just to continue with this, just because I find it so fascinating. There were professional, there appear to be professional sword sharpeners in the Viking Age in Iceland, based on the literary sources like the sagas. There would be people that would take your sword and give you a loaner, and while they had it, they would sharpen it, they would fix it up, they would do whatever's needed, and then you'd come back in a few weeks and get your sword back from them.
Wow, I can see it. That's pretty cool.
And
And it's
sorry, it's really important because if you get a nick in the edge of a sword, which is very easy to do with the kinds of materials that were available for swords in that era, if you parry a sword cut, you might get edge on edge contact, and that's bad. That's going to create a nick, and that nick causes a stress concentration to develop, and that now becomes a possible place where the sword can break. So you want to get rid of that nick ASAP before you use the sword. And it might be that that is one of the big reasons that swords were double-edged. We're always very puzzled why were double-edged swords used. Both edges are identical, but it's clear again from the wear patterns that people always put their swords in their scabbard the same way, which meant they always drew them in the same way. So it was always the same edge getting used. Maybe the second edge was if the first one got dull or dented or something like that, they could flip the sword around and continue to fight.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because it's, like the later medieval and Renaissance combat treatises that the HEMA folks used constantly talk about the back edge or the false edge and cuts that you make with that edge. But that does not seem to be something that a Viking Age fighter would have used. It simply doesn't have the strength. And they were all about strength, about power, about destroying whatever was in front of them. And the back edge, the false edge, can't do that. It just does not have the power.
Well, and that's fascinating because in a sense you have the same development, the double-edged sword, but for a different reason, for a backup versus a style of fighting that does have those back sweep cuts.
Yes.
And modern knife fighting typically uses very little in the way of back sweep cuts. I'm thinking of something like MBC, martial blade concepts, or what's the Filipino style it's based on? I can't remember what it's called, but there's not a lot of those back sweep cuts. Because I think of that relatively underpowered arm motion. That's fascinating stuff. Well, and Matt Markley answers my question. The Filipino stuff is Eskrima or Kali in general. Yeah, so I was thinking about. Yeah, that stuff's pretty interesting, and probably has something to do. I mean, knife fighting has got to be pretty different from sword fighting, just because you can be. And knife fighting, you are so much more at risk of being cut yourself.
Yeah, no, you're just so much closer. The range is so much closer, and you have options. And one of the things that is very clear with Viking fighting is they were not at all averse to finishing the fight grappling. There might be an opportunity, just drop the weapon and go into grappling. Now, most often that happened when the weapon was no longer useful. Maybe it got dull, maybe it got broken, maybe something else. But sometimes it just happened that it made sense to go under the weapon and just grapple. Drop what you're holding, go under and grapple. And so many of the fights finish up on the ground with one person controlling the other and killing the man by breaking the neck or biting out the throat or drawing a secondary weapon to finish the fight.
Sure. I mean, biting the throat, specifically being Egel. I know the story you're talking about. John F. White asks, is there anything you've discovered about the Old Norse culture that you use or do regularly in the present day?
I would have to say no, not anything really comes to mind. To be quite honest, no.
How often do you practice? Do you get together and spar?
Okay, so first of all, there's been a change in our training in that last fall we decided to close our training center and pull back a bit and figure out where we go from here with our training. When our training center was open, we had training sessions 3 times a week. So we would have groups of people coming in and doing this training. Some people came once a week, some people came twice a week, some people came to every single session. And each session was, I would say, very carefully planned and prepared. We had a goal, we had something very specific that we wanted to test or try or practice or learn. And we would spend the time working on that and it was a progression, basically continuing to do our research. Now that we have closed the training center, we're trying to figure out what we can do to fill in that gap. So right now the training sessions are very irregular, to put it mildly.
Do you, question for me, do you analogize a lot or draw influence from Eastern Asian martial arts? I think about kendo, or I believe there's a Chinese martial art that's focused on the spear, the name of which I can't remember. Do you draw much from that, or look to that for?
No, we do not. That was an area that we looked into and sort of rejected. Rejected is too strong a word. We did not find much that helped us understand Viking fighting. And a lot of this has to do with what we call the mindset of the Viking warrior. And it's probably worth saying a few words about that. We strongly believe that the Viking people, first of all, it's clear that they had a law code. There was this whole series of laws, and adherence to those laws was a central part of their culture. But in addition to that, they carried a set of unwritten rules in their heart. And these rules guided them in their daily life, and it also guided their behavior in combat. These rules said, it's okay for me to do this, or this, or this, but this is a line I cannot cross and remain an honorable man. So there was something that guided them, and we think of this as their mindset. And the example that I sometimes use is consider the mindset in medieval Japan of a samurai versus a ninja. They're both from the same society. They speak the same language. They use same weapons. They have the same DNA, but they fight totally different because their mindset is so different. The samurai is going to stand there and wait and attack at the exact right moment, and the ninja is just going to come around on his backside and kill him. So, even in something where they're from the same society, mindset changes how people fight. And understanding what Viking warriors' mindset was is another big part of our research. And we have to tease that out of many, many sources, mostly the literary sources, but other things as well, to understand what it was that guided these people's behavior.
Right. When you mention lines that a warrior might not cross to avoid being dishonorable, do you have a specific example of how that might affect how someone would fight someone else?
Let me see. One example that comes to mind is the idea that you treat a weaker person well. So you don't attack someone who's lying on the ground. So you don't attack women or children. So for instance, if you're burning a house down to attack the people inside, you start the fire and then you allow the women and children to come out.
Right, like Flosi and Yelsar.
Yeah, and so on. So there are these things where certain things are honorable, certain things are dishonorable. It's this whole Drenger versus Nidinger concept that comes out so strongly in the sagas.
Right, and of course in a society where so many, at least in the sagas, so many instances of combat are more or less dates. I mean, they're scheduled between the parties, not these ambushes, but you think about these duels. There would have to be a code that was strongly enforced, even unspoken, just about what you do and how you show up and how you conduct yourself. Yeah, absolutely. And you see that, for instance, I think of the scene that's in Vatnsdøla Saga, and it's also in Cormac's Saga, where what's the guy's name? Jökull is going to fight. I think it's Cormacer. And then Cormacer has a friend who's a witch who makes a snowstorm so that he can't make it to the fight. But then this causes this entire scandal about what a Niðingar he's been, and Jökull makes a Niðing pole, right? Phoenix says, so they fight like Klingons.
Yes, something like that.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't think that's a terrible comparison. I don't know Star Trek very well, but I kind of have this impression that the Klingons are supposed to be a fairly regimented straight up fight kind of culture, which I think is part of what the Vikings are, and probably a little bit like samurai, although very different code in a lot of ways, I would think too. Greek hoplites might be another analogy, probably Athenian hoplites are a better analogy than Spartans are.
Mhm.
But this has been a really interesting discussion. Would you also tell us where we ought to follow up on these subjects? You said you have a book out, you've got the website. Where would you tell people to start if they want to really start digging into Viking combat and weapons after this?
Okay. So the book that I wrote 12 years ago is way out of date. Our research has progressed so far. So use it as a historical document rather than as something to be carefully studied. Things that we believed 12 years ago, we no longer believe. Our website, the Hurstwic.com website, is a place to start. But again, that's not fully up to date either. I have been remiss in not keeping it as up to date as I wish. We have some training videos that can be purchased or streamed. Those are more up to date, and they will give a sense of how you should train to become a Viking fighter and some of the moves that Vikings used in their fighting. And then we have our 2 documentary films, again, which can be purchased as a DVD or streamed on great battles of the Viking Age.
Okay.
But in answer to your question, what do I recommend? I can't recommend much of anything right now. All I can say is please wait a little while. We'll have something coming out soon. It's in progress.
So keep an eye on the Hurstwic website.
Yes.
All right. And where do you use social media? Where can we follow you on?
Yes. So we have a Facebook presence. We also have a YouTube channel. So all of those are possibilities.
Okay. And I'll put links to those on the YouTube video for this. I do see one more question from Cameron Patterson. Did other Germanic cultures, like the Anglo-Saxons, differ in their fighting techniques to any meaningful extent?
Okay.
That may be a bigger question than.
Yeah, so the simple answer is I don't know. My understanding is the weapons of people like the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons and so on were very, very similar to Viking weapons. And because the weapons were similar, there's probably going to be a lot of similarities in the fighting. But there's a difference in culture. There's going to be a difference in mindset. And so that is going to change the nature of the fighting. Now, what that actually implies to the nature of the fighting, I can't answer because I've not studied those cultures to the same depth. And so I can't really give you a good answer.
Well, in their literature, such as it is, I mean, we're so spoiled in Old Norse, having all of these sagas. I mean, you look at Gothic and you've got Bible translation and a Bible commentary. I mean, we're so much poorer in our ability to approach those cultures on their own terms. That I think often we're very tempted to analogize them to Vikings, but we just can't ever really be sure that they were all that similar. That's part of why I try to be pretty specific about the fact that I'm using Norse sources to talk about Norse mythology, and we can infer about larger Germanic myth and culture, but it's so hard to know for sure. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I really appreciate it. And I didn't realize I've been mispronouncing the name of the website for 20 years because I saw it as just an old English word.
Yes.
Right, so I was just sort of supplying the palatalization of the sea.
Yeah. No, it was completely made up by people who didn't really know much about the language. It has no meaning.
Well, okay. I don't know. I saw it. It just looked like an old English place name to me. Well, thank you very much, sir, and thank you to everyone who attended. And from beautiful Colorado, I wish you all the best.
Yes.